Live on WFLA Now. With a specialized degree in climate, Chief Meteorologist and Climate Specialist Jeff Berardelli is pioneering the way we look at climate and extreme weather. Welcome to Jeff's Climate Classroom, powered by ArmorView Window and Door.
All right, welcome everybody to today's Climate Classroom. Now, as anybody who watches this show knows, we are in the midst of an energy transition, and in part, that is to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But there's a lot of misinformation and sometimes coordinated disinformation about renewable energy, and it's widespread, and it's threatening to undermine public support for the transition. Now, in a new report, the Columbia University Law School's Sabin Center identifies and examines 33 of the most pervasive false claims about solar energy, wind energy, and electric vehicles. And today, we're excited to have the report's main author. Let me bring up my guests right here, who you see in the middle. That is Matthew Eisenson. He's the senior fellow at the Renewable Energy Legal Defense Initiative. He's located right now at Columbia University in New York City. Hey, Matthew.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
We're excited to have this. It's going to be cool. And my co-host, WFLA's own climate curious, Val Simpson. Hey, Val, as usual.
Right.
Love having you.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Jeff. Hi, Matthew. I'm really excited about this episode. I know that it's going to be very educational, but at the same time, I know it's going to be quite entertaining as well. So I am looking forward to this.
This is going to be a good one. Val is, and she doesn't just say that. She's not just throwing out that term. She actually has been very excited about this.
Yeah, I drive
episode.
Jeff crazy on a lot of these topics.
She does. She does drive me crazy, and also on these topics. So that's beside the point. Okay,
I'm going to buzz you.
Yeah, I don't know if people can hear the buzzer.
No, I don't think so. We're not going to use it today. We're going to leave it to
anybody
the side.
who's never watched this before, Val has a buzzer, and to shut me up, she'll press that button every once in a while.
That's right. But I'm also going to be monitoring any Facebook comments or questions that you might have for Matthew. So by all means, if you are listening right now and you want to ask something, I'll be looking at those questions.
All right, Matthew. So you put this huge report together. Oh, and by the way, before I get into the question, I wanted to ask you more about your work for the Renewable Energy Legal Defense Initiative. So I'll just say quickly, it's pro bono work. You work for essentially communities that are trying to put in renewable energy, and they may be facing resistance, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
So, I'm a lawyer by training and a senior fellow at the Sabin Center. And my work is focused on tracking legal obstacles to getting wind and solar projects approved. So these are things like lawsuits filed to stop the projects, restrictive zoning ordinances that make it impossible to build a wind or solar project. There are counties in the United States now that have setback requirements of 3 miles from the nearest property. So if you want to put up a single wind turbine, you need to have 36 square miles of land. So we do this tracking of legal obstacles, and then we also work with local residents, community groups, and small environmental groups that would like to bring wind and solar into their communities.
I feel like what you just mentioned can be a whole show in itself, where essentially government is coming in and saying, okay, we're not going to outlaw renewable energy, but we're going to make it so difficult for you to achieve renewable energy that you're not going to even be able to do it economically.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so I want to get to that later in the show, but the first thing I want to ask you about, and Val, we can go back and forth. I'll ask the first question. Okay. Yeah. I want to ask this question because it's one of my pet questions, which is, and it drives me up the wall, but there's this thought out there and this information being disseminated that offshore wind development is harming whales. We're seeing a lot of right whales that are washing up on shore. But is it truly the offshore wind development that in fact is harming whales, Matthew?
So there's really no evidence of that. And I'm glad that we started with this one, because the misinformation about whales and offshore wind is one where we have very, very good evidence that misinformation is influencing public opinion. There's been a lot of polling data in New Jersey over the years about whether residents support offshore wind, and public support has fallen off a cliff over the last few years at the same time as there's been this coordinated misinformation campaign. What else could be causing it? Well, there's been an enormous increase in cargo ship traffic. Cargo ship traffic in the New York, New Jersey area has gone up by, over 20% since 2019. And that's far more likely than what is actually happening. One really important thing to point out in New Jersey, There's not even any offshore wind construction there yet. It's only exploratory activities.
Well, Val
Interesting.
had an interesting comment about that. We saw in one of the articles that the sound,
Sonar.
people are saying it's the sonar, right? But it's, first of all, from what I understand, when you're surveying for oil and gas, that sound is a lot more powerful because you have to survey much deeper to find the oil and gas than you do to essentially plant the wind turbine in there. And one of the scientists who studies, the biology of the ocean, so whales as one example, said that it was almost like the equivalent of a fan in your room, like a ceiling fan or something in your room. So it's really, the sound that it's coming from the surveys of these areas where they want to put wind turbines is really fairly inconsequential, but that is what a lot of people are saying is killing these whales.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Both in terms of the, unfair treatment of this one industry compared to others that, have louder sounds. And, also a really important thing about the whale impact is that it's avoidable. We mentioned in our report the Vineyard Wind Project. So this is going to be one of the biggest offshore wind projects that we have in the United States. It's already delivering some power to the mainland. And the developer, before beginning construction, entered into this groundbreaking agreement with 3 big environmental nonprofits and agreed to all sorts of measures to avoid impacts to whales. So they don't do any pile driving in the season when right whales are present. And they agreed to limit their vessel speeds to very, very slow speeds, forever. Other types of vessels aren't subject to these restrictions.
And a lot of this is entanglement. If it's
Right.
vessel strikes, but it's also entanglement. I've been seeing that a lot lately about whales that are dead and there's evidence of entanglement.
Yeah, so there's a lot of attention on the North Atlantic right whale because the population is just so tiny. It's, it never recovered from whaling, over 100 years ago. There are only about 300 of them. So, an impact to any right whale could be considered a population level impact, which makes it a very difficult, situation for any sort of developer to operate under. But the leading anthropogenic causes, like the leading causes of death that are caused by humans are vessel strikes are 75% of the deaths, and entanglement is the next one. Entanglement with fishing gear, lobster traps.
And this can be proven by autopsies, obviously. So if they're finding these whales offshore, this is why they're able to prove that. So, those are the numbers. So I don't know where they're getting that it's the wind turbines causing it.
Well, is it? Well, wait, you just asked them a question. So where is this disinformation or misinformation coming from?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of scholarship on the misinformation in the offshore wind context in particular. There's a professor at Brown University named Timmons Roberts who can speak to this, and he's mapped out all of the different groups that are involved in spreading these messages. And some of them do have fossil fuel links. I think of all of the areas that we look at in our report, the connections between fossil fuel industry and misinformation are the clearest with offshore wind. And we even see it in the lawsuits. There were 4 lawsuits trying to stop the Vineyard Wind Project. They were all, ostensibly focused on impacts to marine mammals, but none of them were brought by established environmental groups. And one of them,
They were brought by oil companies, you're saying.
One of them was brought by fishing industry groups who were getting pro bono legal representation from the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is funded by fossil fuel groups.
I think people need to understand, you mentioned it, but I need to be clear about this, that disinformation is actually making a big difference in public opinion. In New Jersey, just a couple of years ago, the approval of offshore wind among its citizens was somewhere around 75 to 80%. Now that approval is down below 55%. And a lot of that is likely due to this disinformation or misinformation about the way wind might be harming whales. And again, keep in mind, there is no actual wind out there yet. There's no infrastructure at this very point. They're just simply surveying for possible locations. All right. So, Val, why don't we move on to the next question?
Well, we're going to stay in the topic of wind turbines, but this is the other false claim that we want to kind of debunk here. So it says that low frequency noise from wind turbines harms humans and cause wind turbine syndrome.
Yeah, so the idea here is that these low frequency noises that are so low in frequency that we can't even hear them, they're not audible, are causing physiological harm, like insomnia and headaches and general malaise. And there's a surprisingly large amount of scholarship on this topic, in almost almost overwhelming number of articles. But the general consensus is that there is no direct causal relationship between this low frequency noise and any of these symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
sorry.
No, I was going to say, to be clear, it's understandable if a certain group of people don't want to see a wind turbine in their community, right? I mean, they may think it's ugly. I happen to like wind turbines, but some people may not like the sight of it. They may not even like the hum, even though it's a very small hum. They may not like the hum. But didn't President Trump many years ago say that wind turbines or windmills can cause cancer? Am I wrong about that? Am I misremembering?
No, I think that's right. And they certainly do not cause cancer. But what's interesting in some of these studies is that, sometimes maybe there is an indirect impact. In some areas where people live near wind turbines, they have experienced, loss of sleep and headaches. But what the research has found is that these effects are more likely due to just being annoyed at the presence of wind turbines. If you're very annoyed about something, it can cause you to be stressed out, and stress can have impacts on your physiology. It can affect your sleep. Right. So to the extent people are experiencing these things, it's probably just because they don't like the turbines.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Did you? I guess I'll take the next one, Val.
Go ahead.
All right.
We're gonna.
Okay.
Skip to a next
claim
one.
number 31. And by the way, folks, you can read more about his report on WFLA.com. I have it in the Climate Classroom article, and then you'll see it as the first article in there, and I have a link to his report.
Because I guess that what we forgot to say, I'm sorry to interrupt, is that there's a total of 33 false claims that the report goes into. Yeah. So it's definitely worth your while to take a moment and go through them and figure out exactly what the false claims are, who's saying them, because I noticed that you guys have that also. And you debunk them as you go along in the report. So yeah, that would be, we only chose 6. Well, Jeff didn't let me pick any more.
Are you kidding me? You think I have any control over Val at all?
But no, one thing, before we move on to the EVs, because the next one is the EV one, I know that, Matthew, you had mentioned something about wind turbines, and you said that it affects agriculture land.
Well, I was speaking more about in the solar context. One of the false claims that we hear come up all of the time is that if we allow this solar project to be built on this farmland, we're not going to have food in the grocery stores. And that is just completely false. It's an extremely common false claim that we hear all the time. I was at a public hearing in Ohio earlier this month, and there were a dozen speakers who came up to say the same thing. But the United States has 800 million acres of farmland, and the most wildly ambitious scenarios for getting to 100% zero emissions energy would require about 10 million acres for solar. So it's a very small percentage would be required, and we're already using tens of millions of acres for producing corn ethanol.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
All right. So the next question is about EVs. Claim number 31: EVs will cost the U.S. many auto jobs.
Yeah. So this is an interesting one. I mentioned with wind turbine syndrome that there are a lot of peer-reviewed academic articles about the subject. There's not a lot of academic literature on this one, and there's just not a lot of evidence in general. So Emily Pontecorvo at Heat Map has a really good article on this topic that says, it looks at where does this claim come from and what's behind it. And here, what we have is there's this sort of, the logic is that electric vehicles have fewer parts. And if you have fewer parts, that requires less labor. And, there's a statement, a quote from the Ford CEO a few years ago saying that producing an EV requires 40% less labor. And that's been taken out of context. If you keep listening, he goes on to explain that there is, battery production is a whole separate issue. So if you are looking at producing a car without looking at, the labor that goes into producing a battery, then maybe you end up, with the conclusion that, less labor will be needed, and then this will be bad for jobs.
I mean, but what the IRA is doing is it's pulling a lot of that manufacturing back to the United States. So essentially, in many ways, it may be actually creating more jobs because otherwise those parts would be made overseas. So now we have the batteries being constructed here in the United States and a lot of the parts from the car being constructed here in the U.S. Yeah. So in many ways, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, is kind of an equalizer. And it may end up with net job creation, I assume.
Right. And I think that the point about battery factories is important. The IRA does incentivize construction of manufacturing facilities in the United States. And, to avoid losing jobs from the U.S. auto industry and, the economy at large, it might be necessary to build these factories.
All right. Val, you want to take the next one?
Yes, I do. I have this one. I've heard this one a lot from people. It says that EVs are impractical due to range restrictions.
Yeah. So if you look at the data from the 2021 models, the average electric vehicle had a range of about 234 miles, and the average combustion engine had a range of just over 400 miles. So the EV was still, only about 60% of the range. But there now are some models that get over 400 miles. And, I'm not here to tell people to buy an EV, but if you're just looking at the average person who lives in a single family home and is commuting to work, an EV, with whether it's 250 miles or 400 miles, is going to be adequate for most of your trips. And the question is really just, how much do you feel like you need to plan for the, low frequency event of a long drive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I have to say the same thing. I have a plug-in hybrid. I don't think at this point it would be useful for me to have a purely EV car because I live in a condominium and we don't have chargers in the condominium yet. We're going to get them, but there is some growing pains. And so I think it's clear that we be honest with the folks at home. We don't think necessarily that everyone should have an EV tomorrow. It depends on your own personal case. I'm not ready. A couple of years from now, when we have chargers in my building, I'll jump on it. We don't have it yet. And what about you, Val?
No, same thing. I feel that if you live close to where you work and you are not, you don't use your car to work, because a lot of people do have to rely on their vehicles all day. I think that it might be a good idea. It depends on everybody's individual lifestyle and where they live. If you have a single family home and you can plug it in, why not give it a chance, But I understand your situation in the condo. It wouldn't be a great idea. I also think that with advancements in technology, this will be something that, like what Matthew was saying, when they first came out, kind of like when the iPhone came out and it had like a few bugs and little glitches. And then each year when the new version comes out, they're doing it better and better. So I think that also. Yeah,
I have absolutely no doubt. And listen, this may or may not happen, but Toyota says they'll have an EV battery that has 750 miles worth of range by 2027. Let's say Toyota's wrong, though. Because a lot of people say, well, that's wishful thinking. That's a lot. They're developing kind of a hybrid solid state battery. And, if they're truly capable of doing it, then maybe they will have a car that has 700 or 750 miles of range. Even if they don't by 2027, that eventually, maybe 10 years from now, cars are going to get 600, 700, 800 miles of range. And then it's going to be double that of combustion vehicles. So the point is, there are growing pains. And I think that there's this fighting going on between the two sides, right? EVs versus combustion. But all the reasons to fight over this will be gone in about 10 years. The plugging infrastructure, the availability of lithium, which, is becoming more available across the U.S. right now, especially in California and out west. In addition, Matthew, I think in one of the articles you talked about sodium-ion batteries, which are being built and already on market in China. They don't deliver as much range, but for people who are just, looking for a cheaper car where they can drive inside of a city or whatever. Right. Anyway, sorry, Matthew. Wait a second. You're our guest. Wait a second. Right. Matthew's our guest.
I need to buzz you.
Val, there we go.
Matthew, you can't hear this, but I am buzzing him so he could stop talking.
Yeah, but I mean, you're absolutely right about the charging infrastructure. I think the more the charging infrastructure that's in place, the more comfortable people are going to be renting EVs and buying EVs. I went to a wedding in Southern California a few weeks ago, and we rented a car from LAX, and we chose to get an EV. And it just did require a little research before the trip. We called ahead and made sure that the hotel would have EV charging on site. When we got to the dealership and turned it on, it said the battery was 92%. We entered the address and it said, by the time you get there, the battery will be 30%. And it ended up being, extremely accurate prediction. I think we got there with 31 or 32%.
Oh, there we go.
Very cool.
Okay,
That's
I know
awesome.
that you're a man of limited time. So, and by the way, is there a drop dead time for us here, Matthew? Is it now?
Yeah, not on my end.
Oh, you sure? Okay. All
A
right.
few more minutes, we promise. We'll let
Okay.
you go. We're just having so much fun with this. I think we should move into the solar part of it, even though Matthew did bring up already a little bit of that. But claim number 13 would be that solar energy is unreliable and requires 100% fossil fuel backup.
Yeah, so people say this all the time. They say solar is unreliable, and I don't think reliability is the right word here. When regulators look at reliability, what they're looking at is how many outages are you going to have? How long are these outages going to be? How hard is it going to be to fix them? And at the grid level, we found you can add a lot of solar, you can add a lot of wind, and not compromise reliability. You could be producing solar all day while the sun is out, producing excess power that goes into batteries, and be producing power through the night with wind. And with long distance transmission, you could be pulling in energy from other parts of the country. And then you also have firm power with hydro, nuclear, increasingly geothermal. So this idea that you need 100% fossil fuel backup just isn't true. And it's not what we've seen. We've seen California dramatically increase its share of solar while decreasing its share of natural gas without compromising reliability.
But I do think it's worth mentioning that there are some big obstacles, one of them being interconnection and transmission, that being a big issue. Also, batteries. Are batteries truly up to the task yet? Yes, you can complement solar, and you should, with batteries, but there's a lot of work going into batteries. The amount of money, I wanted to do this for a couple of days now. I'm going to do it at some point when I get a chance. Look at just how many battery projects are being researched right now, how much capital is going into finding the next great battery or making batteries better. It's got to be gajillions. I don't know if is it gajillions? Is that a real?
I don't think so.
No?
I should buzz you for
that. But you should buzz me. But a lot of money's, I'd say almost more than almost any other research into clean energy, it's probably going into batteries right now. So just want to make sure that people understand we're not poo-pooing the idea that solar only works some of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. And, I wouldn't recommend that anybody just, slap solar panels on their roof and disconnect from the grid. That's not going to work. It is intermittent. I think the key point here, though, is that solar is not unreliable. It does exactly, what we expect it to do, and we plan for the fact that it's intermittent. And it can be integrated without, compromising reliability and increasing outages.
You want to go to the next one, Val?
Yeah, let's move on to the next one. The next one would be number 12. And it says that solar panels won't work in cold or cloudy climates. That's a big one.
Yeah, we hear it a lot too. When a solar project gets proposed somewhere like upstate New York or Michigan or Ohio, people will say, solar belongs in the desert West, if anywhere. Why are you building it here? It's cold and cloudy here. Mm-hmm. There are a few issues with that. One, cold weather doesn't affect solar, at all. If anything, it's helpful. Two, cloudiness, it does affect solar. A very cloudy day can reduce energy output by 45%. But this isn't a surprise to anybody. When a utility is deciding whether to purchase power from a solar farm, they look at something called the capacity factor, which is an estimate of how much of the day will this solar project be operating at full capacity. And they plan for the cloudy weather, and it's just part of their equation. The last issue here with this idea, and Jeff mentioned the constraints on transmission, this idea that we could just sort of import all of our energy from Arizona or California in the desert West, it's not realistic. We don't have nearly enough long distance transmission right now in the United States, and getting transmission projects approved is just as hard, if not harder, than getting wind and solar projects approved.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. All right. Is there anything else you want to ask him? I do want to ask him more about the work that he does with the organization that he's working with, his pro bono work, because I think it'd be instructive to understand exactly what kind of obstacles he's running into and why he's having to defend people who want to put solar and wind in their community.
Right. Well, I mean, and this is something that we were talking about also last week, because I said to Jeff, I'm like, I understand when these big oil companies get to go to court, they have big pockets, they can, definitely sustain the cost. But what about, the folks that are fighting for it? We were talking about the lawsuit that was won in where was it? In Switzerland.
Right. Well, the older ladies,
The older
right,
ladies
in the
that won
international court. Yeah.
So I said, I'm like, who's backing them? How do they help? Because it was years. It wasn't something that happened overnight. So yeah, Jeff is like, you'd be surprised, but a lot of this stuff is actually pro bono.
And this is the guy. This is Bono or Bono? Oh wait,
Yeah.
Bono is a rock star, but you're working pro bono. So can you explain? I'm curious. Maybe even give us an example. Explain to us the kind of work that you do.
Yeah, sure. So, one thing to understand about, renewable energy and the permitting is that so much happens at the local level. If you're looking at offshore wind, there are federal lawsuits, it's in federal waters, but most projects that are on private land are being evaluated by state agencies or local agencies. We've been involved over the last few years in 3 or 4 different matters in front of the Ohio Power Siting Board. And what happens is that the developer will submit an application and say, I would like to build a 1,000-acre solar farm on this land, and the landowner is willing to lease it out. And then what we'll often see is that some number of people in the community, it could be 1 or 2 or 10 or 12, really don't want it to happen. They really don't want it to happen. It's often the people who live closest to the project site. They don't want to look at a solar farm. They don't want to look at a wind farm, whatever it may be. And they will organize against it. They'll start a Facebook group and start a petition against the project. They'll start a website. There's a website called notosolar.com that was created to, stop solar projects in Michigan. And these websites will often be full of misinformation, like a lot of the claims in our report. And you'll have people showing up at public hearings stating these claims.
But they're not necessarily from that local area. They may be imported from 1,000 miles away. No?
Right. So, at the public hearings, people will often identify, where they're from. And, they'll say that, I'm here, I'm a resident of Madison County, and this is what I think. But the claims on the website are often just copied and pasted from claims on other websites, elsewhere. So this misinformation sort of travels across the country, and it ends up showing up in the disputes that we get involved in.
Wow.
So can you give us one example of something you're working at now so people can kind of really understand what's going on?
Yeah. So there's this project in Ohio called Oak Run Solar. And the siting board just issued a certificate. It would be 800 megawatts of solar, which is really big. And what's really significant about the project is that it's on 6,000 acres of land, and it's going to involve 4,000 acres of agrivoltaics. This is dual use agriculture and solar production. And we've been representing an individual who supports the project, and he lives about 1,000 acres from the project site. He's a civilian employee of the U.S. Air Force, and his work at the Air Force is actually focused on solar panels. He works on the solar panels that go into satellites. And his argument in front of the siting board is, I understand this technology. I understand that it's clean. I understand that solar panels are not going to be leaching heavy metals into the water. And I would rather live next to a solar farm than a dairy farm with 10,000 head of cattle. Which was, what was proposed, 12 or 15 years ago.
So in this case, though, I want you to go back to the thing you mentioned, how this is a mixed-use project, because that's kind of new, right? Mixing solar panels with farms so that you're not necessarily having to take any farmland. And the farmers, I imagine, are not only making money off of their products, whatever it be, that they're growing or ranching, but they're also making money off of the solar panels, I imagine, because these companies will lease their land. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So with wind, there's historically not been much of a conflict between wind production and how much farming can we do. The wind turbines themselves just don't take up that much space. But with solar, historically, there's been this, concern about, are they taking up too much farmland? And, as I was saying earlier, we don't actually have a shortage of farmland for food production, but it is a concern that the, decision makers like the Ohio Power Siting Board care about. And so developers have started to submit more and more ambitious plans for combining solar and agriculture, both to help win over support and because there can be big efficiencies. You can use sheep to control the vegetation instead of having to bring in people with lawnmowers. And why not grow crops between the panels if you can make it work?
Right. That sounds like a win-win.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with all that said, Val, anything else
I do. I have one more
Okay.
question. Are you seeing any projects in terms of residential, like any solar communities where they're building houses already offering this solar option?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So my work is completely focused on community scale and utility scale solar.
Okay.
But I do know that, on the legal side, many states have passed these what are called solar access laws that prevent homeowners associations from, prohibiting individuals. So I think the obstacles at the residential level are much less severe than at the utility scale level.
Right. Okay. Well, I don't know about you, Val, but I thought this was a great and very cool discussion.
Yes, I did. I learned a lot. Thank you so much, Michael, for debunking all these false claims.
Michael's his boss. He's Matthew.
Oh, I'm sorry, Matthew. Did I keep calling you Michael the whole time? Was
No,
this
only
only
the
time?
once, and I'm very honored.
Yeah, it's
I
funny.
know,
It's
yeah.
funny when Michael
He's
was
great.
when Michael's my professor, he was talking about getting this started. I think maybe when I was there, he was just starting to get this organization started to help provide pro bono legal services to people who needed or wanted to have solar and wind and such in their communities. So I think you might be in the antithesis of that.
Well, thank you.
That's good.
All right. So I want to thank everybody for joining me for this week's Climate Classroom. Remember, of course, you're probably watching it on our Facebook page, WFLA, or on our website, WFLA.com. But you can also listen to this or watch this on YouTube. We're going to take this this whole show that we just did, package it up. We're going to send it over to YouTube, not like that, but we're going to send it. And also, we're going to send it to Spotify and Apple Podcasts so you can listen to it there. Again, Matthew and Val, thank you so much for joining me. And everybody at home, thank you for joining me. I'll see you next week
everybody.
on the Climate Classroom.
Thank you.
Watch or listen to Jeff's Climate Classroom, powered by ArmorView Window and Door on WFLA social media platforms, and find Jeff's climate reports on WFLA.com.